"Give me the fat one," he sneered, pointing at the giant Apache woman offered for just $1. The crowd roared with laughter, dust swirling in the hot street, church bell tolling noon. Everyone thought her fate was sealed, until a scarred mountain man slammed down a silver coin and stunned them all. He didn't buy her to own her. He bought her to set her free. But freedom came with a secret. This woman carried ancient knowledge, water hidden beneath the dying land, enough to save or doom an entire town. And when word spread, greed rose like wildfire. A rancher sharpened his knives. Deputies rattled their jail keys. Whispers of witchcraft filled the saloon as thunder rolled over the desert. Can a dollar's mercy stand against a town's hatred? Or will the secret she carries cost them both their lives? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Benson, making the air shimmer above the packed dirt. The railway depot's shadow offered little relief from the scorching heat as townsfolk gathered around a crude wooden platform. A trader, his vest dark with sweat stains, gestured at 5 Apache women standing in a forlorn line. "Fresh workers here," the trader called out, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Take your pick. Fair prices for able bodies." The women stood silent, their faces masks of dignity despite their circumstances. Their simple cotton dresses were travel-worn, their feet wrapped in rawhide sandals. Most kept their eyes downcast, but one stood taller than the rest, her broad shoulders straight despite the indignity of her situation. Several cowhands lounged against the hitching post, making crude remarks and laughing. Their spurs jingled as they shifted, passing a bottle between them. A heavy-set rancher pushed through the crowd, his expensive boots kicking up dust. His eyes settled on the tall woman, and his lip curled in a sneer. "Give me the fat one," he barked, reaching for her arm. "She looks strong enough for field work." Before his fingers could close on her sleeve, a quiet voice cut through the afternoon heat. "Hold up there." The crowd parted as Jonah McBride limped forward. His worn buckskins and graying beard marked him as a mountain man, someone more at home in the wilderness than town. The old injury from Gettysburg made each step deliberate, but his eyes were sharp and clear as he approached the platform. The rancher's face reddened. "Mind your own business, McBride. Everyone knows you're touched in the head, living up in those hills alone." Jonah ignored him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, worn smooth from years of handling. Without a word, he placed it on an empty barrel beside the trader. "I'm claiming her," he said simply. A murmur ran through the crowd. Women whispered behind their hands, and men exchanged knowing looks, expecting the worst. The tall Apache woman's muscles tensed, but she didn't move. The trader snatched up the silver dollar, testing it with his teeth before nodding. "She's yours then, though $1's mighty cheap for such a strong one." Instead of grabbing the woman or ordering her to follow, Jonah removed his battered hat and held it against his chest. He met her eyes directly, showing respect few others had offered that day. "Ma'am," he said clearly, his voice carrying to the whole crowd, "you're free to go wherever you please. That dollar bought your freedom, not your person." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the cowhands stopped their snickering, confused by this turn of events. The rancher's mouth opened and closed like a fish on dry land. The Apache woman studied Jonah's face carefully, searching for any sign of deception. Finding none, she drew herself up even straighter. "I am called Naichi," she said, her voice strong and clear despite her obvious hunger. Her English was careful but precise. "Why would you do this?" Jonah replaced his hat, adjusting the brim against the sun. "Because it needed doing. No person should own another." The trader shifted uncomfortably. "Now see here, McBride. You can't just— The sale's done," Jonah cut him off. "The lady's free to choose her path." Naichi's dark eyes took in the hostile faces around her, the sneering rancher, and the remaining women on the platform. muscle worked in her jaw as she made her decision. "I choose to leave this place," she announced. Then, with a slight nod to Jonah, "I will walk with you, if that is acceptable." "Much obliged for the company," Jonah replied quietly. As they moved away from the crowd, Naichi walked beside Jonah rather than behind him. Her head remained high, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed them down the street. Her steps, though weakened by hunger, never faltered. The cowhand's laughter started up again, but it held a nervous edge. The rancher spat in the dust, muttering about savages and addled mountain men. But neither Jonah nor Naichi looked back as they made their way toward the edge of town. The afternoon heat wrapped around them like a blanket as they walked, the only sounds their footsteps and the distant whistle of an approaching train. Jonah's limp was more pronounced after standing still so long, but he kept a steady pace. "You have no obligation to me," Naichi said finally, breaking the silence. "No, ma'am, I don't," Jonah agreed. "And you have none to me. But there's food at my cabin, if you're hungry, and safety, until you decide your next step." Naichi considered this as they passed the last buildings of Benson. The desert stretched before them, broken by patches of scrub brush and the distant purple shadows of mountains. "My father was a healer," she said carefully. "He taught me the ways of plants and medicine before the soldiers came. I can work for my food." "Ain't looking for a worker," Jonah replied, "but I won't turn down healing knowledge freely offered." "Winter's hard on old wounds." A ghost of a smile touched Naichi's lips. "Then we understand each other." They walked on as the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon. Behind them, the town of Benson continued its afternoon bustle, already forgetting the quiet drama that had played out in its streets. But something important had changed that day, a small act of defiance against cruelty, a choice to see the humanity in another person's eyes. Naichi's steady stride matched Jonah's limping gait as they followed the trail into the growing shadows. Neither spoke again for some time, but the silence between them was comfortable, full of unspoken understanding and the first fragile threads of trust. The dusty afternoon that had started with an auction block was ending with two unlikely companions walking toward the mountains, their path forward uncertain but chosen freely. In the distance, a hawk circled on the thermal currents, its cry carrying faintly on the wind, a wild sound that spoke of freedom and the vast open spaces of the territory, where a person might find room to breathe, to heal, and perhaps to begin again. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wagon track as Jonah and Naichi made their way out of Benson. Jonah's old mule plodded along steadily, its hooves raising small puffs of dust with each step. He had offered Naichi a ride, but she had declined with a slight shake of her head. "I prefer to walk," she had said simply, her tone brooking no argument. Jonah understood pride when he saw it. He nodded and kept his mule to a slow pace that matched her stride. The desert stretched around them, dotted with scraggly mesquite and prickly pear cactus. Red-tailed hawks circled overhead, their cries carrying on the hot breeze. Every so often, Jonah glanced at his companion. Naichi walked with perfect posture despite her obvious exhaustion, her feet finding sure purchase on the rocky ground. Her face remained composed, but he noticed how she studied the landscape, marking landmarks and water sources with the careful attention of someone used to surviving in harsh country. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the air grew mercifully cooler. The wagon track narrowed, winding up into rolling foothills covered in juniper and pine. Naichi's pace had slowed, though she made no complaint. When they crossed a dry creek bed, she paused briefly to examine the cracked mud. "Water's getting scarce," Jonah offered, breaking the hours-long silence. "Creek by my cabin's running low, too." Naichi nodded. "The springs in these hills are failing. My father knew where the deep waters run, but that knowledge..." She trailed off, her expression distant. The track curved around a steep hillside, and Jonah's cabin came into view. It was a rough-hewn structure of pine logs, weathered gray by sun and rain. A small corral stood empty beside it, and a stack of split wood leaned against the north wall. Smoke rose from the stone chimney. He'd banked the morning's fire before heading to town. Jonah dismounted stiffly, his bad leg protesting after the long ride. He led the mule, too. The corral, removing its saddle and bridle with practiced motions. Naichi stood in the cabin's shadow, taking in every detail of the remote homestead. "It ain't much," Jonah said, "but it's dry when it rains and warm when it snows." He climbed the 2 steps to the cabin's door, his limp more pronounced now. Inside, embers still glowed in the fireplace. He added kindling and blew them back to life as Naichi entered cautiously behind him. The cabin's single room was spare but orderly. A narrow bed occupied one corner, while a smaller cot stood against the opposite wall. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a few battered pots sat on the stone hearth. A rough-hewn table held a lamp and 2 tin cups. Jonah lit the lamp, its warm glow pushing back the gathering dusk. He moved to the fireplace and lifted the lid of a cast-iron pot hanging over the embers. "Venison stew," he said. "Made it fresh this morning. There's cornbread, too, if you're hungry." Naichi's composure wavered slightly at the mention of food. "I would be grateful," she said quietly. Jonah served the stew in wooden bowls, adding thick slices of cornbread. They sat at the table, the lamp casting flickering shadows on the log walls. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the scrape of spoons and the pop of burning wood. Finally, Naichi set down her spoon. "Your leg troubles you greatly," she observed. "How did you come by such an injury?" Jonah was quiet for a moment, staring into his bowl. "Confederate sharpshooter at Gettysburg," he said finally. 18 years ago now, but some days it feels like yesterday." He shifted in his chair, stretching the stiff leg. "Bullet shattered the bone. Army doctors wanted to take it off, but I was stubborn. Never healed quite right." Naichi's dark eyes studied him with new interest. "You were a soldier then, before becoming a mountain man?" "Was. Ain't proud of much from those days." He pushed his empty bowl aside. "War has a way of making monsters of men." "Yes," Naichi said softly. "This I know too well." She straightened her shoulders, as if coming to a decision. "I am the daughter of Taze, who was known among my people as a great healer. He taught me the old ways, which plants bring sleep, which ease pain, which draw poison from wounds." Her voice grew distant. "But soldiers came to our lands. They said we must go to the reservation at San Carlos. My father." She paused, grief flickering across her features. "He would not go. He said a healer must stay free to gather medicines, to help those in need. They shot him when he tried to run." The lamp flame wavered, casting strange shadows. Jonah remained silent, letting her words hang in the air between them. "I ran too," Naichi continued. "I could not bear the reservation. The sickness, the hunger, the walls of soldiers watching always. So I slipped away, thinking I could live as my father taught me. But there were men." Her hands tightened into fists on the table. "Men who hunt for bounties, who sell people like cattle." "Ain't right," Jonah said quietly. "What they did to you, what they're still doing." Naichi met his gaze steadily. "Why did you help me today?" Jonah looked down at his twisted leg, considering his words carefully. "Reckon I've seen enough of men's cruelty. Sometimes a body has to stand against it, even in small ways." He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping on the plank floor. "The spare cot's yours, if you want it. Blankets are clean." He limped to the fireplace, adding another log to the flames. The wood settled with a shower of sparks. "You'll decide your path in the morning," he muttered, not looking at her. "No obligations either way." Naichi rose from the table, her movements graceful despite her weariness. "Thank you," she said simply. "For the meal. For the truth of your words." The lamp burned low as they prepared for sleep, its gentle light softening the cabin's rough edges. Outside, a coyote called from the hills, its lonely voice echoing across the darkened land. Inside, two people who had known too much of the world's hardness found an unexpected moment of peace, built on shared honesty and the recognition of each other's dignity. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold when Naichi woke to the rhythmic thunk of an axe splitting wood. The spare cot creaked as she rose, wrapping a thin blanket around her shoulders against the morning chill. Through the cabin's single window, she watched Jonah's silhouette, his movements steady despite his limp as he worked at the chopping block. The cabin floor was cool beneath her feet as she moved to the door. Outside, the air held the crisp sweetness of early morning, though she could already feel the promise of another scorching day. Dew sparkled on scattered patches of grass, catching the first rays of sunlight. Jonah paused in his work, leaning on the axe handle as she approached. Sweat already darkened his shirt despite the early hour. "Morning," he said simply, then resumed his rhythmic chopping. Naichi nodded in response, her attention drawn to the creek bed that curved past the cabin. What had once been a steady stream had dwindled to little more than a trickle, barely enough to wet the stones. The sight stirred memories of her father's teachings about the sacred nature of water in desert lands. She walked to the creek's edge, kneeling in the sandy soil. Her fingers traced patterns in the dirt as she studied the ground with intense concentration. The land spoke to those who knew how to listen. Her father had taught her this truth from her earliest days. The sound of chopping ceased. Jonah's uneven footsteps approached, stopping a respectful distance away. "Something interesting in that dirt?" he asked, curiosity tempering his natural reserve. Naichi sat back on her heels, still studying the ground. "The water has not abandoned this place," she said quietly. "It flows still, but beneath the earth, where few know to look for it." "That so?" Skepticism colored Jonah's voice, though he tried to hide it. "And how would you know that?" She rose, brushing dirt from her skirts. "My father was more than just a healer. He was a keeper of old knowledge, including the ways of finding water." Her dark eyes met his steadily. "He taught me to read the land's signs, the types of plants that grow, the way the ground feels, the sound earth makes when it holds water in its depths." Jonah's weathered face showed doubt, but he didn't dismiss her words outright. "Sounds like useful knowledge in these parts," he said carefully, "though I've never heard tell of such things." "Many of your people don't listen to such wisdom," Naichi replied without rancor. "But the knowledge remains true all the same." She gestured to the cabin. "If you have food to share, I will show you after we eat." Inside, Jonah stirred up the banked fire and set coffee to boil, while Naichi mixed cornmeal with water for morning bread. They worked in comfortable silence, moving around each other in the small space with growing ease. When the coffee was ready, they sat at the rough table, sharing the hot bread and strips of dried venison. As they finished eating, Naichi rose. "Now," she said, "I will show you what I mean about the water." The sun had climbed higher, burning away the morning's coolness as Naichi began walking the land around the cabin. She moved with deliberate purpose, occasionally kneeling to press her ear against the ground. Jonah followed, his limp more pronounced after his morning's work, watching with a mixture of curiosity and lingering doubt. She worked in an expanding spiral from the cabin, paying special attention to areas where cottonwood trees grew. These ancient sentinels, their leaves shimmering silver green in the morning light, often marked the presence of underground water. Near a particularly large specimen, she stopped and knelt once more. "Here," she said, pressing her ear to the earth. "Listen." Jonah lowered himself awkwardly to the ground beside her, wincing as his bad leg protested. Following her example, he pressed his ear to the soil. At first, he heard nothing but the whisper of wind through the cottonwood's leaves. Then, faintly, he detected something else, a sort of hollow resonance, different from the dead sound of dry earth. That sound, Naichi explained, tells of water moving deep below. The cottonwood's roots reach down to it, but a well dug here would bring it to the surface. She sat up, brushing dust from her hair. My father could hear such things more clearly than I, but this sign is strong. Jonah sat back, considering her words. The land had been growing drier each year, the creek's failing flow a constant worry. If what she said was true, reckon it's worth a try, he said finally, pushing himself to his feet, though it'll be hard digging. He retrieved a shovel and pickaxe from the cabin's lean-to, and they began to work. Naichi insisted on taking turns with the tools despite Jonah's initial protests. Her strength surprised him. She wielded the pickaxe with practiced skill, breaking up the sun-hardened earth. The morning wore on into afternoon as they dug deeper. The hole grew steadily, its sides straight and true. They worked in companionable silence, broken only by the sound of tools striking earth and their measured breathing. When the sun stood high overhead, they paused to rest in the cottonwood's shade, sharing water from Jonah's canteen. My father would say that water teaches patience, Naichi remarked, wiping sweat from her brow. It moves slowly through the earth, wearing away stone over many seasons. So too must we be patient in seeking it. Jonah nodded, understanding the truth in her words. They resumed digging, taking turns as before. The hole deepened past their waists, then their shoulders. The earth changed as they went deeper, becoming darker and cooler. It was late afternoon when Jonah's shovel struck something different. Instead of the dry, packed earth they'd been fighting all day, this soil was damp. He dug more carefully now, and water began to seep from the walls of the hole. Well, I'll be damned, he breathed, staring at the moisture darkening the earth. He looked up at Naichi, who stood at the hole's edge. You were right. A small smile touched her lips, the first he'd seen from her. The old knowledge remains true, she said simply. With more digging and proper lining, this well will serve your land for many seasons. Jonah planted his shovel in the earth and leaned on it, surveying their day's work. For the first time in years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. Hope for his land, hope that the failing creek wouldn't force him to abandon the home he'd built here. He looked at Naichi with new appreciation, understanding that she possessed wisdom he'd never imagined when he'd stepped forward in that dusty street in Benson. She met his gaze steadily, her dignity undiminished by the day's hard labor. The setting sun painted the cottonwood's leaves gold as they gathered their tools to return to the cabin. Tomorrow would bring more. Work. The well needed to be deepened and lined, but the hardest part was done. They had found water where others would have seen only dry earth, and in doing so, they had discovered something else, the beginning of trust. The rhythmic thud of hammer on wood echoed across Jonah's land as he and Naichi worked to reinforce the newly discovered spring. Sweat darkened his shirt despite the cooling afternoon air. Nearby, Naichi carefully fitted stones around the wooden frame, her movements precise and purposeful. This will keep the soil from collapsing, she explained, tapping another stone into place. The water needs a clear path to rise. Jonah nodded, driving another nail into the plank. Reckon you've done this before? Many times, with my father. Her voice held a note of pride mixed with old sadness. Every spring we found needed protection, just like this one. The snap of a twig caught their attention. Jonah's head jerked up, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle propped against a nearby tree. Through the brush, he glimpsed a rider moving away at a quick trot, one of Buck Henderson's ranch hands, by the look of his horse. Naichi had seen him too. Her face remained calm, but her shoulders tensed. He will talk. Yep, Jonah resumed hammering, though his jaw had tightened. Best finish this before sundown. They worked steadily as the sun sank towards the horizon, completing the basic structure around the spring. Water already pooled clear and sweet in the stone-lined basin. Looking at it, Jonah felt a mixture of pride and unease. Good water was precious in these parts, precious enough to fight over. I need supplies, he said finally, wiping his hands on his trousers. Best ride into town now, before the store closes. Naichi looked at him steadily. You expect trouble? It wasn't a question. Jonah adjusted his gun belt, checking that his revolver moved freely in its holster. Trouble usually finds me whether I expect it or not. The town of Benson hummed with evening activity as Jonah rode in. He could feel eyes following him as he tied his mule outside the general store. Inside, the storekeeper's usual friendly greeting seemed strained. Jonah had just finished paying for rope and nails when the saloon doors across the street burst open. Buck Henderson stormed out, his face red with whiskey and anger. Two of his ranch hands flanked him as he crossed the dusty street. McBride, Henderson's voice boomed across the gathering crowd. Heard you've got yourself an Indian witch finding water on your worthless piece of land. Jonah stepped onto the boardwalk, his bad leg stiff after the day's work. Evening, Henderson. Don't recall my business being any of yours. It's everybody's business when you're stealing Indian secrets. Henderson jabbed a finger toward Jonah's chest. That Apache woman of yours, using her heathen ways to find water while honest folks' cattle die of thirst. The crowd had grown larger. Whispers rippled through it. Witch. Indian magic. Ain't natural. Jonah's voice cut through the murmurs, quiet but sharp as a knife. The lady's name is Naichi. She's free as any person here, and her knowledge belongs to no man but God. Henderson's face darkened. Free? She's nothing but a savage you bought for $1, and now you're using her witchcraft. That's enough. Jonah's hand hadn't moved toward his gun, but something in his stance made Henderson step back. Miss Naichi knows the land and its ways better than any of us. There's no witchcraft in understanding what God put in plain sight, if you've got the wisdom to see it. Wisdom, Henderson spat in the dust. I'll tell you what I see, McBride. I see a man gone soft in the head, taking up with an Indian witch. That water you found? It belongs to whoever's strong enough to take it. The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Jonah met Henderson's glare steadily. That a fact? Well, here's another fact for you. My land, my water, my choice who I share it with. Any man who thinks different is welcome to discuss it with me. His hand rested casually on his gun belt. Henderson's face twisted, but he wasn't drunk enough to draw against Jonah's reputation. This ain't over, McBride, he snarled, backing away. You and your witch better watch yourselves. The crowd began to disperse, but Jonah caught the sidelong glances, heard the continuing whispers. He gathered his supplies and mounted up, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on his back as he rode out of town. Night had fallen by the time he reached the cabin. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their cries echoing off the hills. Naichi sat by the fire she'd built outside, its flames casting dancing shadows on her face. She looked up as he dismounted. They fear what they do not understand, she said simply. Jonah settled beside the fire with a grunt, stretching out his aching leg. Henderson means to make trouble. Reckon standing against him in the town won't come cheap. Truth always costs. Naichi's voice held no bitterness, only calm certainty. My father taught me that as well. The price of knowing the land's ways was being called witch by your people. The price of healing was being feared by those who needed help most. She stirred the fire, sending sparks dancing upward toward the stars. But truth remains truth, whether they believe it or not. The water flows where it will flow. The plants heal as they have always healed. What matters is not their fear, but our choice to honor what we know is right. Jonah studied her in the firelight, seeing the strength that ran deeper than any well they might dig. Won't be easy, he said quietly. Few worthy things are. Naichi met his gaze. But I will not shrink from their insults, nor hide the knowledge my father entrusted to me. The question is, will you stand firm when the cost grows higher? The coyotes called again, closer now. Jonah fed another stick to the fire, considering her words. He'd faced worse than Buck Henderson in his time, but this felt different. This wasn't just about water or land. It was about choosing between the easy path of going along with the town's prejudices and the harder road of standing up for what he knew was right. Reckon I made my choice when I laid that $1 down, he said finally. Don't see much point in backing out now. Naichi nodded, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned lower and the coyotes sang their ancient songs to the desert night. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, the peace of shared purpose settled over them like a blanket of stars. Dawn painted the Arizona sky in soft pinks and golds as Jonah and Naichi began their work. The new spring bubbled clear and steady, a testament to their previous day's labor. Wooden buckets sat ready beside the stone-lined basin, their handles smooth from years of use. Jonah tested his weight on his bad leg, grimacing slightly. Long day ahead, he muttered, reaching for the first bucket. Naichi moved with practiced efficiency, her movements precise and purposeful. The corn needs water now, while the sun is still low, she said, dipping her bucket into the spring. The plants will drink deeper. They fell into a rhythm, hauling water from the spring to the small patch of struggling corn. Back and forth they walked, their footsteps creating twin paths in the dusty soil. The morning air grew thick with heat as the sun climbed higher. Jonah's limp became more pronounced with each trip, but he kept pace. Sweat darkened his shirt and dripped from beneath his hat brim. Naichi worked steadily beside him, her face serene despite the effort. She had tied her long black hair back with a strip of leather, and her skirts were kilted up for easier movement. The sound of approaching horses broke their concentration. 3 riders appeared on the trail, leading their mounts at an easy walk. Jonah recognized them as smaller ranchers from the valley, men who usually nodded when they passed his cabin. Today they pulled up to watch, amusement clear on their sun-weathered faces. "Say, McBride," called the first rider, "you planning to water every stalk by hand?" Laughter rippled among them. The second man shook his head. "Waste of time, if you ask me. That corn's barely worth feeding to pigs." "Might as." "We'll be dumping them buckets straight in the dirt," added the third, chuckling. Jonah straightened, shifting his weight to his good leg. His face remained impassive as he lifted another bucket of water. The men's words rolled off him like rain off a tin roof, leaving no mark. Naichi paused in her work, studying the riders with calm dignity. "The land remembers those who care for it," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "When the corn grows tall and green, it will speak for itself." The riders exchanged glances, their smiles fading slightly at her quiet confidence. They moved on after a few more moments, their laughter drifting back on the hot breeze. "They doubt because they cannot see what will be," Naichi said, returning to her task. "Let the land prove them wrong." Jonah nodded, respecting her wisdom. They worked through the heat of the day, stopping only briefly to drink from tin cups and share a simple meal of cornbread and dried venison in the shade of a cottonwood tree. As the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in deep oranges and purples, the clip-clop of another horse drew near. This time, it was Reverend Callahan's elderly mule picking its way carefully along the trail. The circuit preacher sat easily in his worn saddle, his Bible secured in his saddlebags. "Evening, Jonah," the Reverend called out, his Irish lilt softening the words. He dismounted stiffly, leading his mule toward them. "Miss Naichi." Naichi inclined her head respectfully. Jonah set down his bucket, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Evening, Reverend. Long ride from town?" "Aye, but a pleasant one." Reverend Callahan's kind eyes took in their work, the new spring, the watered corn, the well-worn path between them. "I heard about yesterday's trouble in town." Jonah's shoulders tensed slightly, but the Reverend held up a weathered hand. "I came to thank you, Jonah." Standing up to cruelty isn't easy, especially when it wears the mask of respectability. The old preacher turned to Nietzsche, his manner gentle but direct. "The Lord sees your dignity, child. He knows the wisdom he has given you, even when others mock it." Nietzsche's eyes softened at his words. "Thank you, Reverend. Some of your people show kindness when we least expect it. Would that there were more kindness to show?" The Reverend sighed, looking out over the freshly watered corn. "But perhaps this spring of yours will help wash away some of the bitterness between peoples. Water has a way of bringing life to more than just plants." They talked a while longer as evening settled around them. Reverend Callahan spoke of his circuit, the families he visited, the changes he'd seen in the territory. When he finally mounted his mule to leave, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "Remember," he said, gathering his reins, "the good Lord often works through the most unexpected hands. We need only be willing to see his grace where others see difference." With a gentle touch of his heels, he guided his mule back toward town. Jonah and Nietzsche watched until the Reverend disappeared into the gathering dusk. They built a small fire outside the cabin, its flames pushing back the night's chill. Nietzsche brewed coffee in a battered pot, while Jonah sat silent, staring into the flames. "The Reverend speaks of your God with great faith," Nietzsche said quietly, passing him a tin cup of coffee. Jonah's scarred hands wrapped around the warm cup. "Been a long time since I gave much thought to God," he admitted. "Saw too much during the war, lost my taste for prayer when I lost my family to fever after." He took a sip of coffee, the bitter liquid matching his memories. "Seemed like the Almighty wasn't listening much to folks like me anymore." Nietzsche was quiet for a moment, watching the fire dance. "My people say that even when the spring is hidden, water still flows beneath the earth. We must only know where to listen." She looked at him thoughtfully. "Perhaps this spring is your first prayer answered." The words settled deep in Jonah's chest, stirring something he'd thought long buried. He stared into his coffee, remembering how to hope felt like learning a forgotten language. The night deepened around them, filled with the soft sounds of cricket song and the distant call of a whippoorwill. In the darkness beyond their fire, the newly watered corn waited for morning, each stalk holding the promise of growth, of renewal, of faith restored drop by precious drop. Dawn stretched into dusk, and dusk into dawn again as the days flowed together like water in the spring. The rhythm of shared work shaped their hours, each task falling naturally between them. The late summer air hummed with cicadas and possibility. Jonah shouldered his old Springfield rifle early each morning, checking his trap lines in the cool shadows before the sun climbed too high. His limp was worse in the damp, but he pushed through it, bringing back rabbits, quail, and once a young deer. The meat would see them through the coming weeks, and the hides could be traded in town. Nietzsche tended the spring as if it were a living thing, clearing debris and monitoring its flow. Her hands moved with certainty, checking the wooden walls they'd built, adjusting stones to direct the precious water. Under her care, the corn patch began to show promise, tender green shoots pushing through the dark soil toward the sun. One evening, as Jonah returned from checking his snares, his leg seized badly. The old wound, aggravated by the day's work, sent shooting pains from hip to knee. He stumbled, catching himself against the cabin wall, his face tight with pain. Nietzsche looked up from where she was hanging herbs to dry. Without a word, she helped him to the wooden bench by the door. "Wait here," she said, her voice firm but gentle. Inside the cabin, she gathered supplies, dried herbs from her collection, clean cloth, water from the spring. Jonah watched as she worked, grinding the herbs into a paste with practiced movements. The familiar scent of healing plants filled the air, yarrow, sage, and others he couldn't name. "Your leg speaks of old hurts," she said, kneeling beside him. Her hands hovered over his scarred thigh. "May I?" Jonah hesitated. It had been years since anyone had touched him with healing intent. The thought made him uncomfortable, yet the pain was fierce enough to override his reluctance. He nodded once, sharp and quick. Naichi's touch was professional, but gentle as she rolled up his pant leg, exposing the twisted scar tissue. The Confederate bullet had torn through muscle and sinew, leaving its mark in more ways than one. She studied the wound with knowing eyes, her fingers ghosting over the damaged flesh. "The bullet was angry," she said softly. "It left poison in the spirit as well as the body." Jonah's throat tightened. "Reckon it did at that." She began applying the poultice, her movements sure and steady. The paste was cool against his heated skin, and gradually the sharp edges of pain began to dull. As she worked, Jonah found himself studying her face, the quiet concentration in her eyes, the slight furrow between her brows. "My father taught me these medicines," she said, breaking the silence. "He was a healer among our people." "Before." Her voice trailed off, but Jonah understood what remained unsaid. "Before the reservations. Before their world changed." "He did right by you," Jonah managed, his voice rough. "Teaching you such things." Naichi's hands stilled for a moment. "He taught me more than healing. He taught me to hold on to who I am, even when others would take it away." She resumed her work, wrapping the poultice with clean cloth. "That is why I cannot go back to the reservation. To live behind walls, watched like animals, it would kill something inside me." The confession hung in the evening air between them. Jonah thought of his own walls, built not of wood and wire, but of grief and memory. "Lost my family after the war," he said suddenly, the words coming unbidden. "Fever took them while I was still learning to walk proper again. Wife, 2 little ones. He hadn't spoken of them in years, had locked their names away in the quiet corners of his heart." Naichi finished tying off the bandage, but didn't move away. "The fever took many that year. Both your people and mine." "Sarah," Jonah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My wife's name was Sarah." The boys were Thomas and John. Speaking their names felt like opening a long sealed door, letting light touch what had been hidden in darkness. "They walk with you still," Naichi said softly, "as my people walk with me, even when we are apart." The cicadas sang in the gathering dusk, their chorus rising and falling like breath. Naichi rose and moved to the fire pit, where a pot of venison stew simmered. She served them both in tin bowls, the rich aroma mixing with wood smoke and evening air. They ate in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one. The poultice worked its medicine, easing the worst of Jonah's pain. But it was more than his leg that felt lighter. Sharing the weight of old sorrows had loosened something in his chest, like ice breaking up in spring. Naichi spoke of her family on the reservation, an aunt who taught her to weave, cousins who still sent word when they could. Her voice held love and longing in equal measure, but no regret. "They understand why I had to leave," she said, stirring the fire with a stick. "Even if it pains them. Better to live free and true than to surrender what makes us who we are." Jonah nodded, understanding more than he could say. They were both exiles of a sort, he from the land of memory, she from the land of her ancestors. Yet here, in this small clearing by the spring, they had found something unexpected, something that neither was ready to name, but both felt taking root like the corn in the newly watered earth. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on their faces. The night settled around them like a blanket, full of cricket song and distant coyote calls. Neither moved to go inside just yet, content to sit with what had been shared between them. Jonah's leg still ached, but differently now, a healing ache rather than a wounding one. Naichi's medicine worked in his flesh, while her presence worked a different kind of healing. He watched her profile in the firelight, struck by how natural it felt to have her there, as if she had always been part of this place. The cicadas hummed their endless summer song, witnesses to the quiet understanding growing between two souls who had found each other in the vast Arizona territory. Neither spoke of what might come next. For now, it was enough to share the fire, the food, and the knowledge that they were no longer alone in their chosen exile. The July sun blazed mercilessly over the Arizona territory. Jonah stood at the edge of their corn patch, marveling at the strong green stalks that stretched toward the sky. The plants had grown taller than he'd expected, their leaves broad and healthy, despite the scorching heat. It was a testament to Naichi's knowledge. She'd known exactly how to channel the spring water to nurture their crop. "They grow strong," Naichi said, coming to stand beside him. Her dark eyes held pride as she reached out to touch a corn leaf. "Like children who know they are loved." Jonah nodded, still amazed by how the land had transformed under their care. The spring flowed steady and clear, its banks now lined with stones and wooden supports they'd built together. It was a far cry from the failing creek he'd relied on before. But beyond their protected patch of earth, the drought's grip tightened. Each day brought new signs of its severity. Dust devils danced across parched fields, and the distant hills shimmered in the heat like mirages. Reports from town grew dire, wells running dry, cattle dropping dead in sun-baked pastures. One morning they heard hoofbeats approaching. Jonah tensed, his hand moving toward his rifle, but Naichi touched his arm. "Listen," she said softly. "Those are not angry riders." She was right. The group that appeared was led by Sarah Miller, whose husband worked one of the smaller spreads north of town. Behind her, 2 other families followed, their wagons creaking. All looked worn, their faces etched with worry. "Mr. McBride," Sarah called out, her voice cracking. "We heard tell you have water here. Our wells run dry and the children—" She trailed off, glancing at the small faces peering from the wagons. Jonah shifted uncomfortably. He'd feared this moment would come, when desperation drove folks to his land. The spring was precious, their lifeline. Sharing it could bring more than just these families. It could bring trouble. But Naichi stepped forward, her bearing dignified. "Water flows from the earth by Creator's will," she said. "It was not meant for one alone." She looked at Jonah, and in her eyes he saw both challenge and compassion. It made him think of scripture he'd learned long ago, about cups running over and mercy flowing like streams in the desert. "Reckon you're right," he said finally. "Let's get those barrels filled." What followed was a day of hard work under the burning sun. Jonah and the men rolled empty barrels from the wagons, while Naichi showed them how to draw from the spring without disturbing its banks. The children, once shy, grew bold enough to splash in the shallow parts, their laughter rising like music. Mary Jenkins, whose family ran the general store, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her youngest drink deeply from a dipper. "God bless you both," she whispered. "We didn't know where else to turn." Word spread quickly. By week's end, more families came seeking help. Some brought trade goods, preserves, cloth, ammunition, though Naichi and Jonah asked nothing in return. Others brought only their gratitude and willing hands to help with the work. Jonah watched it all with growing wonder. The spring became a gathering place, where people who'd barely spoken in town found themselves sharing news and helping each other fill barrels. Children who'd once been warned away from the Indian woman now crowded around Naichi, listening wide-eyed as she taught them the spring's song. Even more surprising were the changes in the adults. Tom Wilson, who'd once spat tobacco juice at Naichi's feet in town, now removed his hat when speaking to her. His wife Susan brought cornbread still warm from the oven, saying it was the least they could do. "Ain't never seen nothing like it," Reverend Callahan remarked one evening, having ridden out to help organize the water sharing. "Folks working together, breaking bread like neighbors should, reminds me of the early church, when all things were held in common." Jonah watched a group of women chatting as they waited their turn at the spring. Martha Reynolds, whose husband owned the lumber mill, stood shoulder to shoulder with Betty Davis, who took in washing to feed her children. The drought had stripped away pretenses, revealing their common humanity. "It's like the water washes away more than just thirst," Nietzsche observed quietly. "It washes away the walls people build between themselves." She was right. Something was changing in the way people looked at each other, spoke to each other. The desperate need for water had forced them to see past their differences, to recognize their shared vulnerability. And in that recognition, something new was being born. One afternoon, as the sun began its descent, Jonah sat on his porch watching children play near the spring. Their voices carried on the hot wind, mixing with the sound of water flowing, and women talking as they filled their barrels. The scene before him was so different from the lonely existence he'd known before. Nietzsche joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You're thinking deep thoughts," she said, handing him one. "Thinking about mercy," he replied. "How it changes things. Changes people." He gestured toward the gathering. "Never thought I'd see the day when folks from town would break bread at my table, or trust their children to play on my land." "The spring gives life," Nietzsche said, "but it is the choice to share it that brings healing." She paused, watching a group of boys help an elderly man roll his barrel to his wagon. "Your people have a story about a man who struck a rock and water flowed forth to save many." "Moses," Jonah nodded, "in the wilderness." "Perhaps this is also a wilderness time," she said, "when old ways must die so new ones can be born." The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. One by one, the families loaded their filled barrels and headed home, calling out thanks and promises to return. The children waved goodbye to Nietzsche, some running back for final hugs before their parents called them away. As twilight deepened, Jonah looked at his land, at the thriving corn, the clean flowing spring, the well-worn path now leading to his door. He thought of how he'd once prized his solitude, how he'd built walls around his grief and called it strength. But watching the last wagon disappear into the gathering dusk, he realized something had shifted inside him. The spring had brought more than water to his parched land. It had brought life back to places in his heart he'd thought forever dry. And though he couldn't yet name what was growing between him and Nietzsche, he knew it was as real as the corn stretching toward heaven in their fields. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Clayton Mills paced his drought-stricken ranch. The wealthy rancher's boots kicked up dust from what used to be green pasture, now nothing but cracked earth. Another of his prized cattle lay dead nearby, bloated in the merciless sun. His ranch hands stood silent, watching their boss's rage build like the storm clouds on the horizon. "That Indian witch and her crippled protector mock us," Mills spat, his face twisted with hatred. "Their corn grows tall while my herd dies. Their spring flows while honest folk suffer." He turned to his foreman, eyes glinting with malice. "Tonight we set things right." As darkness fell, Mills and 3 hired men crept through the shadows toward Jonah's homestead. They carried burlap sacks and leather pouches filled with arsenic meant for prairie dogs. The moon ducked behind clouds, hiding their approach. Inside the cabin, Jonah slept fitfully, his bad leg aching with the changing weather. Nietzsche rested on her cot, dreaming of the morning's work ahead. Neither heard the soft footfalls outside. Mills' men worked quickly. 2 scattered arsenic into the spring's source, while the others trampled through the cornfield, breaking stalks and crushing the growing ears beneath their boots. Their boss watched with grim satisfaction as they poisoned the water that had brought so much hope to the community. Dawn broke gray and heavy. Jonah stepped outside and stopped short at the sight before him. The corn lay broken, stalks snapped and muddy boot prints everywhere. His heart pounding, he limped toward the spring. Naichi emerged from the cabin and saw the destruction. "No," she whispered, running to the ruined field. She knelt among the broken plants, touching their crushed leaves with gentle fingers. Jonah reached the spring and noticed something wrong immediately. The usually clear water had a strange sheen, and dead insects dotted its surface. He dipped a finger in and brought it to his lips. The bitter taste made him spit and gag. "Poison," he called out, his voice rough. "They've poisoned the spring." Naichi rushed to his side, her face pale. "The children who were to come today for water. We have to warn them." Jonah was already moving toward the barn. "We'll ride to town." They saddled Jonah's mule and set out at a fast pace, the morning sun burning away the clouds. But Clayton Mills had already put his plan in motion. When Jonah and Naichi arrived in Benson, a crowd had gathered outside the general store. Mills stood on the wooden sidewalk, his voice carrying across the street. "My own eyes saw her dancing by moonlight, calling on dark powers to curse the spring. She's brought this drought upon us with her heathen ways." Angry voices rose from the crowd. Parents clutched their children closer, remembering how they'd let them play near the spring. Others muttered about witchcraft and savage ways. "It's lies!" Jonah shouted, dismounting awkwardly. "Mills poisoned our spring. He destroyed our corn." But the crowd's fear had turned to anger, and they wouldn't listen. A rock flew, striking Jonah's shoulder. Another followed. He stumbled, trying to shield Naichi. "She's bewitched him too," Mills called out. "See how he defends the witch." Two deputies pushed through the crowd. Instead of restoring order, they grabbed Naichi's arms. She stood tall, refusing to struggle even as they twisted her wrists behind her back. "Stop this!" Reverend Callahan's voice cut through the chaos. The old preacher made his way forward, his Bible clutched to his chest. "Have you all lost your minds? This woman has helped every family here. Stay out of this, Reverend," Mills warned. "This is about law and order." "This is about greed and hatred," Callahan shot back. "You're using fear to—" A rough hand shoved him aside. The elderly man stumbled and fell hard against a hitching post. Jonah lunged forward to help the preacher, but someone stuck out a boot. He crashed to the dusty street, his bad leg twisted beneath him. Pain exploded through his body as kicks rained down. "Stop!" Naichi cried out, struggling now against the deputies. "He's done nothing wrong!" But the deputies were already dragging her toward the jailhouse. Her voice carried back through the crowd. "Truth cannot be buried. The land knows. The water knows." Jonah tried to rise, but more kicks drove him down. Through blurred vision, he saw Mills smirking from the sidewalk. The rancher touched his hat in mock salute before turning away. "Get him out of here," someone said. Rough hands grabbed Jonah's arms, dragging him toward an alley. Reverend Callahan struggled to his feet, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "The Lord sees this injustice!" he called out, but his words fell on deaf ears as the crowd dispersed, leaving Main Street empty save for the dust settling in the morning sun. In the jailhouse, the deputies threw Naichi into a cell. She stood at the bars, her dignity intact despite their rough handling. Outside, thunder rolled again, but no rain fell. The drought held its grip, and with it, the fear that had turned neighbor against neighbor. Jonah lay in the alley, his body battered, his heart aching worse than any physical pain. Everything they'd built, everything they'd hoped to teach the town about mercy and sharing God's gifts, it all lay broken like their trampled corn. The sound of unsteady footsteps made him open his eyes. Reverend Callahan knelt beside him, pressing a handkerchief to his own bleeding forehead. "This isn't over, son," the old preacher said softly. "Truth has a way of coming to light." But as the morning wore on and the sun beat down on the dusty town, truth seemed in short supply. In her cell, Naichi sang softly, prayers of her people that rose above the walls of her prison. And in the alley, Jonah fought to stay conscious, knowing that somehow they had to find a way to prove Mills's treachery before fear and hatred claimed more victims than just their spring. Darkness crept through the small barred window of Benson's jailhouse. Naichi sat cross-legged on the rough wooden floor, her back straight against the cold stone wall. The cell smelled of old straw and despair, but she refused to let fear break her spirit. Instead, she closed her eyes and began to pray in the language of her people. "Great Spirit," she whispered in Apache, "give me the strength of the mountains that have watched over our people since the beginning of time." The familiar words brought comfort, carrying her thoughts back to her father's teachings. She could almost hear his deep voice, smell the cedar smoke from his healing fire. He had taught her that trials were like swift-flowing rivers. They could either drown you or make you stronger, depending on how you met them. "Remember," he had told her, "our people have endured because we know how to bend like the willow in the storm, not break like the rigid oak." A rat scurried across the floor, but Naichi didn't flinch. She had learned young that fear was a choice. Instead, she began to sing softly, an ancient melody that spoke of sacred springs hidden in canyon walls, of water that flowed pure and eternal from the heart of the earth. The song filled the small cell, pushing back the shadows. Each verse reminded her of home. The smell of rain on desert sage, the sound of wind in the pines, the taste of fresh spring water cupped in her hands. These memories were more than comfort. They were strength, flowing into her like life-giving. Water into dry earth. Across town, in his remote cabin, Jonah McBride lay sprawled on the plank floor. His body ached from the beating, and his bad leg throbbed with renewed agony. Blood had dried on his face, and every breath brought sharp pain from his ribs. He had barely managed to drag himself home before collapsing. The creak of wagon wheels outside barely registered until Reverend Callahan's weathered face appeared above him. The old preacher knelt beside him, his kind eyes filled with concern. "Easy now, son," Callahan murmured, pressing a cool cloth to Jonah's swollen face. "Let's get you cleaned up." With gentle hands that belied his age, the Reverend helped Jonah onto his cot. He worked in silence, washing away blood and applying salve to the worst bruises. When he touched Jonah's leg, the younger man gasped. "Looks like they knew right where to hit you," Callahan said grimly. "Cowards, the lot of them." Jonah stared at the ceiling, his voice hollow. "They've got Naichi locked up like an animal. After all she did for them, the water, the healing, everything, they turned on her like wolves." "Fear makes people forget their better nature," Callahan replied, wringing out the bloodied cloth. "But God hasn't forgotten. He sees everything." A bitter laugh escaped Jonah's lips, ending in a groan of pain. God? Where was he when they were beating me in the street? Where was he when they dragged Naichi away? "The same place he was when they nailed his own son to the cross," Callahan answered quietly. "Sometimes he lets evil have its moment so that good people can choose to stand against it." "What's the point?" Jonah whispered, closing his eyes. "I've got nothing left. No strength to fight, no influence with the town. They won't listen to reason now." "If you quit now, evil wins," Callahan said firmly. "Is that what you want? To let hatred triumph over love? To let fear destroy everything you and Naichi built together?" When Jonah didn't answer, the preacher reached into his coat and pulled out a worn Bible. Its leather cover was soft with age, its pages yellow and dog-eared. He pressed it into Jonah's hand. "I've carried this through 20 years of circuit riding," he said. "It's seen me through blizzards and bandits, drought and despair. When I had nothing else, I had these words." Jonah's fingers traced the cracked spine. "I haven't opened a Bible since the war. Since I watched good Christian men slaughter each other in the name of righteousness." "Maybe that's why God brought Naichi into your life," Callahan suggested. "To remind you that faith isn't about what men do in God's name, but what God does through people who choose love over hate." The Reverend stood slowly, his joints creaking. "I'll be back in the morning with food and medicine. But tonight I reckon you've got some wrestling to do, just like Jacob did, all night long with the angel." After Callahan left, silence filled the cabin. Jonah lay still, feeling every ache in his battered body. The Bible rested heavy on his chest, like a weight of judgment. Or was it possibility? Finally, his fingers opened the book. Random pages fluttered past: David facing Goliath, Daniel in the lion's den, Esther risking everything to save her people, stories of impossible odds and unlikely heroes. Without meaning to, Jonah found himself whispering into the darkness. Not formal prayers like he'd learned as a boy, but raw words straight from his wounded heart. "God," he breathed, "I don't know if you're listening. I don't know if you care about a broken-down soldier and an Apache woman who just wanted to help people. But if you're there, if you see what's happening, we sure could use some of that mountain-moving faith they talk about." The words felt strange on his tongue, like a language half forgotten. But as he spoke, something shifted inside him, not a dramatic revelation, but a tiny spark of hope, like the first star appearing in a darkened sky. Miles apart, yet joined in spirit, Jonah and Naichi reached toward heaven in their own ways. Her song echoed off jail walls while his halting prayers filled an empty cabin. Both drew strength from deep wells, she from the wisdom of her ancestors, he from faith he thought long dead. The night wrapped around them like a blanket, holding their prayers, their pain, their hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, in the quiet darkness, they each found a measure of peace. Not the false peace of easy answers, but the deep peace that comes from knowing you're not facing the storm alone. Naichi's song grew softer but didn't cease, carrying ancient truths through iron bars. Jonah's fingers stayed on the Bible's worn pages, touching promises older than his pain. And somewhere between earth and heaven, their prayers mingled like streams flowing toward the same sea. Dawn painted the Arizona sky in soft rose when the jail door creaked open. Two deputies shuffled their feet, avoiding Naichi's steady gaze as they muttered about insufficient evidence. Their warning to leave town hung in the dusty morning air, but she held her head high, unmoved by their threats. Jonah waited outside, leaning on a worn walking stick. His face was still bruised, but his eyes held new purpose. "We're going back to the spring," he said firmly. It wasn't a question. At the spring, the water's usually sweet scent had turned bitter. Dead leaves floated on the surface, and the earth around it felt lifeless. But Naichi wasted no time on despair. She gathered sage, juniper, and other herbs from the surrounding hills, working with quiet determination. Her hands moved with practiced wisdom as she cleaned the spring, removing debris and adding healing plants in careful measure. Hour by hour, the water began to change. The foul smell lifted like morning mist, replaced by the clean scent of herbs. The soil around the spring grew damp and rich again. Jonah watched in wonder as life returned under her careful touch. When worried settlers arrived, their faces pinched with doubt, Jonah met them squarely. "The spring will heal," he declared, his voice carrying newfound conviction. "Naichi is tending it." He gestured to where she worked, her movements sure and graceful. The settlers fell silent, shame crossing their faces as they witnessed her steadfast devotion to healing what others had tried to destroy. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Jonah's yard when hoofbeats thundered toward the cabin. A wagon rattled to a stop, and Martha Stevens jumped down, her face streaked with tears. In her arms, she cradled her 10-year-old son, Tommy, his skin burning with fever. "Please," Martha called out, her voice breaking. "My boy drank from Weber's Creek yesterday. Now he's burning up something awful." Jonah limped from the porch, his heart clenching at the sight of the limp child. The boy's face was flushed red, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. Naichi emerged from where she'd been tending the restored spring. She approached slowly, her eyes fixed on Tommy's face. Martha clutched her son tighter, but desperation won over prejudice. "They say you know medicine," Martha whispered. "Please help him." Dr. Williams is away in Tucson. Naichi knelt beside the wagon, pressing her palm to Tommy's forehead. The boy moaned, his eyes flickering beneath closed lids. She spoke softly in Apache, then switched to English. "Bring him inside. He needs shade and cool air." Jonah helped Martha carry Tommy into the cabin. They laid him on Jonah's cot while Naichi gathered her medicine pouch. The boy's skin radiated heat like sun-baked stone. "How long has the fever been this high?" Naichi asked, sorting through dried plants and roots. "Since morning," Martha replied, wringing her hands. "He was fine yesterday, playing by the creek. Then he woke up burning hot, talking nonsense about shadows." Naichi nodded, selecting several herbs. "The water was bad. Poison in his blood now." She moved to the hearth, where a kettle hung ready. "Need to make medicine tea. Strong medicine." Jonah watched as she worked, her movements precise and practiced. She crushed leaves between stones, added bark and roots, then poured steaming water over the mixture. The cabin filled with a sharp, bitter scent. "It will taste bad," she warned Martha. "But he must drink all of it." Together, they propped Tommy up, his head lolled against his mother's shoulder as Naichi held the cup to his cracked lips. The boy gagged at first, but Naichi murmured gentle encouragement, coaxing him to swallow small sips. Outside, the sun sank toward the horizon. Jonah lit the oil lamp, its yellow light casting dancing shadows on the walls. Martha dabbed Tommy's face with a damp cloth, while Naichi prepared more tea. "Will he—" Martha's voice caught. "Will he live?" "We pray," Naichi answered simply. "Medicine will help. Rest will help more." Jonah paced the cabin's length, his boots scuffing the wooden floors. Each time he passed the cot, he glanced at Tommy's flushed face. The boy's suffering struck too close to memories of his own family, lost to fever years ago. Without conscious thought, Jonah found himself whispering prayers, rough, unpracticed words that stumbled from his lips. "Lord, spare this child. Don't take another one, please." Hours crept by like molasses. Naichi never left Tommy's side, checking his pulse, feeling his forehead, urging more bitter tea down his throat. Martha dozed fitfully in Jonah's chair, starting awake at every sound. Near midnight, Tommy began to thrash, crying out about snakes in his bed. Naichi pressed cool cloths to his neck and chest, while Martha wept silently. Jonah's prayers grew more urgent, a steady stream of pleas mixing with the boy's fevered mumblings. The oil lamp burned low. Jonah added more fuel, watching the flame sputter and grow. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the dark hills. Inside, time seemed suspended in the space between each of Tommy's labored breaths. Naichi sang softly in Apache, healing songs her father had taught her, passed down through generations. Her voice filled the cabin with ancient rhythm, a steady pulse of hope in the darkness. The first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky when Tommy's breathing changed. The harsh gasps smoothed into deeper, easier breaths. Naichi touched his forehead and smiled, the first real smile Jonah had seen from her. "Fever breaks," she announced quietly. "He sleeps normal now." Martha burst into fresh tears, these ones of relief. She grabbed Naichi's hand, pressing it between her own. "Thank you. Oh, thank you. I didn't know where else to turn, and you saved him. You saved my boy." Tommy stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Mama?" he whispered hoarsely. "I'm here, darling." Martha gathered him close, rocking slightly. "You're going to be just fine now." Jonah sagged against the wall, exhaustion and gratitude washing over him in equal measure. He watched as Naichi mixed a final cup of tea, this one lighter in color. "For strength," she explained, helping Tommy sip. "Rest today. Tomorrow he can go home." The sun rose fully, streaming. Through the cabin's single window, Martha insisted on paying something for Naichi's help, but Naichi shook her head. "Medicine is a gift," she said firmly, "like water, meant to be shared." Martha wiped her eyes. "I'll tell everyone what you did. They should know the truth about you, not those awful lies." Jonah straightened. "The rancher's lies, you mean?" Martha's face hardened. "Yes. Claiming she cursed the spring when he's the one who's been poisoning water sources. Everyone's been too scared to speak up, but this—" She hugged Tommy closer. "This changes everything." Naichi said nothing, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. She began tidying away her medicines while Tommy drifted back to sleep, his breathing easy and regular. Jonah stepped onto the porch, watching the morning light spread across his land. The restored spring bubbled cheerfully, a testament to Naichi's knowledge and care. Behind him, he could hear Martha telling Naichi about other families with sick children, asking if she would help them too. "Of course," Naichi answered simply. "That is why I am here." Her words settled something in Jonah's chest, a certainty that God's hand had been at work that night, not just in saving Tommy, but in bringing Naichi to his land in the first place. Sometimes mercy wore unexpected faces, and healing came through paths most folks were too proud to walk. Inside, Tommy slept peacefully while his mother spread word of the miracle, not of cursed water, but of blessed healing, of an Apache woman's wisdom and a long night's vigil, of prayers answered and faith restored, one cup of bitter tea at a time. The morning after Tommy Fletcher's recovery dawned clear and hot. Rancher Wade Hawkins stormed through the doors of the Dusty Spur Saloon, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the wooden floor. His face was red with fury as he slammed his fist on the bar. "That witch woman's got you all fooled," he bellowed to the scattered mourning crowd. "She's probably the one who poisoned that Fletcher boy in the first place, just so she could play savior." Several men shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Tom Wheeler, whose own son had drunk from Naichi's spring during the drought, stood up slowly. "That's enough, Wade," he said firmly. "My boy would have died of thirst if not for their water, and Sarah Fletcher ain't no fool. She knows who saved Tommy." Hawkins spun around, spittle flying from his lips. "You're all blind. First that Indian lover McBride lets her poison our water, now she's casting spells on our children. I said that's enough." Tom's voice carried the weight of a father's conviction. "My family drinks from that spring every day. You're the only one still spreading lies." Other men nodded in agreement. Billy Cooper, whose sister's baby, had survived the drought thanks to Jonah and Naichi's generosity, stepped forward. "Might be time you rode on home, Wade," Billy suggested quietly. "Ain't nobody here buying what you're selling anymore." Hawkins' hand twitched toward his gun, but the cold stares of the gathered men made him think better of it. He backed toward the door, pointing a shaking finger. "You'll see. You'll all see what happens when you trust an Indian." The saloon door banged shut behind him. The men inside exchanged glances, then returned to their coffee. Wade Hawkins' words had lost their power to stir up fear. That Sunday morning, the little white church on the edge of town was fuller than usual. Reverend Callahan stood in his plain black coat, his Bible open on the weathered pulpit. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. "Today," the Reverend began, his Irish lilt soft but clear, "I want to speak about what it truly means to love thy neighbor." Near the back of the church, Jonah shifted in his seat. Beside him, Naichi sat straight and dignified in a clean calico dress. A few curious heads turned their way, but the glances held more respect than suspicion now. "Our Lord Jesus told us that the greatest commandment is to love God, and the second is to love our neighbor as ourselves," Reverend Callahan continued. "But who is our neighbor? Is it only those who look like us, speak like us, worship like us?" The congregation sat in attentive silence as the preacher's words filled the small church. This past week, we saw a clear example of Christian love in action. When others turned away, when lies and fear threatened to poison more than just water, two people chose to show mercy. They shared their spring during drought. They healed the sick. They returned hatred with kindness. Jonah felt tears pricking at his eyes. He blinked hard, staring at his scarred hands folded in his lap. Nietzsche's presence beside him was steady and warm. Some asked how a Christian man could stand with a heathen woman. The Reverend's voice grew stronger. I ask instead, who among us better lived Christ's teachings? Those who spread lies and violence, or those who gave water to the thirsty and healing to the sick? Several people turned to look directly at Jonah and Nietzsche now. Sarah Fletcher, sitting with a recovered Tommy in the middle pews, nodded firmly. The Good Samaritan was a foreigner, considered an enemy by those who passed by the injured man. Yet he was the one who showed true neighborly love. Today, we have seen such love in our own town. Jonah couldn't hold back his tears now. They rolled silently down his weathered cheeks as the Reverend's words washed over him like clean water. Let us pray that God grants us the wisdom to recognize His work, even when it comes through unexpected hands. Let us have the courage to stand for truth and mercy, not be led astray by fear and hatred. After the service, families lingered in the churchyard. Several approached Nietzsche, thanking her personally for her help during the drought. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid her now invited her to social gatherings. Their children crowded around, asking if she would teach them about the plants she used to make medicine. The change in the town's attitude was palpable. Where Nietzsche had once been met with suspicious whispers, she now received respectful greetings. The local mercantile owner even offered her credit at his store, a privilege previously unthinkable for an Apache woman. But Wade Hawkins wasn't finished. The following Wednesday, he rode into town with several hired guns, making a show of their weapons as they dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. I'm filing a formal complaint, he announced loudly. That Indian woman's squatting on water rights that belong to legitimate ranchers. Sheriff Wilson looked up from his desk, unimpressed. Which rights would those be, Wade? The springs on McBride's deeded land. She's diverting water from my property, using Indian witchcraft to steal what's rightfully mine? The sheriff sighed heavily. Now, Wade, you know that's not... He was interrupted by the arrival of 3 well-dressed men on horseback. They wore badges identifying them as officials from the Territorial Water Rights Commission in Tucson. Actually, the lead official said, dismounting smoothly, we're here to investigate several complaints about water rights disputes in this area. He pulled out a leather portfolio stuffed with papers, including some very interesting reports about poisoned springs and threatened violence. Hawkins' face went pale. The official continued, I see we've arrived at an opportune time. Sheriff, might we use your office for some interviews? Over the next 3 days, the officials conducted a thorough investigation. They surveyed property lines, tested water quality, and took statements from dozens of townspeople. Sarah Fletcher's testimony about her son's healing carried particular weight, as did the accounts of families saved by Jonah and Nietzsche's generosity during the drought. The officials were especially interested in examining the spring itself. They watched as Nietzsche demonstrated her knowledge of underground water flows, explaining how she had located the hidden source. Remarkable, the lead official commented, making detailed notes. This traditional knowledge could be invaluable for water management throughout the territory. On the final day, the commission delivered their findings in the town hall. The room was packed as the lead official stood to speak. Based on our investigation, we find no merit to the complaints against Mr. McBride or Miss Nietzsche. The spring lies entirely within Mr. McBride's deeded property, and their water management practices have demonstrably benefited the community. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. The official continued, furthermore, we are recommending an investigation into recent acts of vandalism and intimidation regarding water rights in this region. His stern gaze fell directly on Wade Hawkins, who seemed to shrink in his chair. Miss Nietzsche's expertise in locating and maintaining water sources is a valuable asset to this territory. We will be recommending that the Tucson office consult with her on future water management projects." Hawkins stormed out before the meeting ended. Within a week, word spread that he had sold his ranch and was moving to Texas. Few in town mourned his departure. That evening, Jonah and Naichi sat on the cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The spring burbled peacefully nearby, its water catching the last rays of sunlight. "Looks like we won," Jonah said quietly. Naichi nodded, her face serene in the fading light. "The truth is like water," she replied. "It finds its own path, no matter what stands in its way." The evening air was full of desert sounds: crickets chirping, a distant coyote's call, the soft rustle of wind through cottonwood leaves. Peace had finally come to their small corner of the territory, as welcome as water in the desert. In town, people spoke of change, how a scarred soldier and an Apache healer had taught them more about Christian charity than years of sermons, how the truth had washed away lies like a clean spring washing away poison, how God's mercy sometimes came through the most unexpected vessels. The water flowed clear and sweet, and the corn grew tall in the field beside the cabin. Above it all, the Arizona sky spread vast and promising, holding the hope of more healing to come. The territorial officials' wagon kicked up dust as it rolled away from Benson, but their impact lingered like thunder after lightning. In their wake, the town buzzed with change. Groups gathered on porches and in the general store, discussing what should become of the spring that had caused so much strife. Sarah Fletcher, her recovered son Tommy playing nearby, spoke first at the town meeting. "That water saved lives. Seems to me it needs protecting. Legal protecting." She glanced at Naichi, who sat quietly at the edge of the crowd. "And who better to watch over it than the one who understands it best?" Reverend Callahan stood, his Bible clasped in weathered hands. "I move we petition the territorial government, ask them to grant stewardship of the spring to Naichi." He turned to face the assembled townspeople. "She's proven herself more than worthy of such trust." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jim Cooper, his hat clutched respectfully in his hands, spoke up. "My vote's with the Reverend. That spring's different from regular water rights. Needs someone who knows its ways." Mary Wilson nodded vigorously. "Someone who'll share it fair, like she's already done." The meeting ended with nearly unanimous support. Only a few of Tully's former allies abstained, shuffling away without meeting anyone's eyes. Jonah watched it all from his usual spot near the back wall, his war-wounded leg aching from standing so long. Pride and something deeper stirred in his chest as he observed Naichi's quiet dignity. She accepted the town's support with grace, but never once acted as though she needed their approval to know her own worth. Later that afternoon, Jonah found Naichi by the spring. She knelt in the mud, checking the wooden reinforcements they'd built together. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and shadow, including the strong lines of her face and the gentle way she touched the flowing water. "They're right, you know," Jonah said softly, leaning against a cottonwood tree. "About you being the best one to watch over this place." Naichi looked up, her dark eyes studying him. "The spring belongs to the land," she replied. "We are only its caretakers." "We," Jonah repeated, the word hanging in the evening air. He took a deep breath, pushing away from the tree to stand straighter despite his limp. "That's what I need to speak with you about." She rose from the spring's edge, waiting patiently as he gathered his thoughts. "When I first saw you in town that day," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I acted on instinct. Couldn't stand to see you treated like property." He paused, working through the words carefully. "But I never wanted you to feel beholden to me because of that." "I never have," Naichi said simply. Jonah nodded, relief visible in the softening of his shoulders. "Good. Because what I've come to understand, what you've helped me see, is that I need you here not as someone who owes me, but as..." He swallowed hard. As my equal. My partner. The water trickled over stones, filling the silence between them. A mourning dove called from somewhere in the gathering dusk. I've been afraid, Jonah admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Lost my family long ago to fever. Thought maybe God was punishing me for something. Decided it was safer not to love again. He met her gaze directly. But I can't deny what's in my heart anymore. Don't want to deny it. Naichi stood very still, the last rays of sunlight catching the silver threads in her dark hair. And what is in your heart, Jonah McBride? Love, he said simply, for you. For your strength and wisdom, for the way you face the world without flinching, for how you've taught me to see everything differently, the land, the water, myself. His hand trembled slightly as he extended it toward her. If you'll have me, I want to build something here together. Something that honors both our ways of seeing the world. The spring burbled softly as Naichi considered his words. Her silence wasn't rejection. Jonah had learned to read her well enough to know that. She was giving his offer the careful thought it deserved. Finally, she spoke. When I left the reservation, she said, I vowed never to live under another's authority again. Her eyes held his steadily. I cannot be less than who I am. I wouldn't want you to be, Jonah replied firmly. Your strength is part of what I love. A small smile touched her lips. Then we understand each other. She stepped forward and placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cool from the spring water, but her grip was sure and strong. Yes, Jonah McBride, we will build together. They stood hand in hand as the first stars appeared above the desert. The moment felt sacred, like a covenant being sealed between them, the land and the sky above. Later that evening, lamplight glowed warm in Jonah's cabin, their cabin now. They sat close together at the rough-hewn table, sharing a simple meal of cornbread and beans. The familiar sounds of night surrounded them. Coyotes calling in the distance, the soft rustle of wind through cottonwood leaves, the gentle clicking of cooling stove iron. Naichi reached across the table and touched Jonah's scarred hand. You are not being punished, she said softly, answering his earlier fear. Sometimes loss comes like storm clouds, but rain returns to the desert. Always. Jonah turned his hand to clasp hers. You're my rain, he said hoarsely, bringing life back to barren ground. Their eyes met in the golden lamplight. Slowly, with the deliberate care of people who understand the weight of moments, they leaned toward each other. Their first kiss was gentle, unhurried, like water gradually wearing away stone, like seeds taking root in desert soil after rain. When they drew apart, Jonah saw in Naichi's eyes the same certainty he felt in his heart. They had found their way to each other across barriers of culture and pain, guided by something larger than themselves. Their love had grown like the spring, first a trickle, then a steady flow, finally a life-giving stream that could nurture not just themselves, but their whole community. The lamp flickered, casting their merged shadows on the cabin wall. Outside, the spring continued its eternal song, a melody of hope and renewal. Inside, two hearts beat in newfound harmony, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Together. Late August brought gentler days to the Arizona territory. The fierce summer heat softened into golden afternoons, and the spring that had caused so much strife now burbled peacefully under cottonwood shade. 6 weeks had passed since the town meeting, and change had settled over Benson like morning dew, quiet but transformative. On this particular afternoon, the sound of children's laughter rang out across Jonah McBride's land. Where once there had been only dust and silence, now half a dozen youngsters splashed at the spring's edge, their joy as pure as the water itself. Mind you don't muddy the drinking water, called Sarah Fletcher from where she filled her bucket. But her warning held more amusement than scolding as she watched her son, Tommy, leading the other children in a game of tag around the wooden platform Jonah had built. "The water knows how to clean itself," Naichi said softly, coming to stand beside Sarah. "Children's laughter makes it stronger." Sarah nodded, hefting her full bucket. "Never thought I'd see the day when Tommy would be so healthy again. That fever nearly took him, before you." She touched Naichi's arm. "Well, we won't forget what you did for us." Other settlers moved easily around the spring, drawing water for their homes and livestock. The afternoon had taken on the feeling of a social gathering, with women exchanging news as they filled their containers and men pausing to discuss the weather as they watered their horses. Jonah watched it all from the shade of his cabin porch, his bad leg propped on a stool. The sight still amazed him, how naturally everyone moved around Naichi now, how freely they sought her advice about ailments, or asked her opinion about the weather. The same people who had once crossed the street to avoid her now tipped their hats in genuine respect. "Quite a change from last month," Reverend Callahan remarked, climbing the porch steps to join Jonah. The elderly preacher's eyes crinkled with pleasure as he surveyed the scene. "Sure is," Jonah agreed, shifting to make room. "Sometimes I reckon I'm dreaming it all." The preacher settled into the spare chair, his worn Bible resting in his lap. "No dream, son? Just the Lord's work, done through willing hands." He nodded toward Naichi, who was now showing Mary Wilson's daughter which plants grew best beside running water. "She's been a blessing to this community, though few had eyes to see it at first." "Took some hard lessons," Jonah admitted, remembering the dark days of accusations and violence. His hand unconsciously touched his side where bruises from the beating had finally faded. "Truth often does," Callahan said. "But look there. Even old Jim Cooper's asking her about his wife's cough. Would have sworn that was impossible a month ago." Indeed, the gruff rancher stood hat in hand, listening intently as Naichi described which herbs might ease his wife's breathing. His face held none of its former suspicion, only grateful attention. The afternoon wore on, golden light slanting across the yard as folks began heading home with their water barrels. Jonah rose stiffly, ready to make his daily check of the spring's wooden supports. But before he could step off the porch, Reverend Callahan caught his sleeve. "Hold up a moment," the preacher said, standing. "There's something I've been meaning to do." He raised his voice to catch the attention of those still gathered. "Folks, might I have your ears for a minute?" The scattered conversations quieted. Naichi looked up from where she'd been showing Tommy how to weave a small basket from reeds. She moved to stand near Jonah as the remaining townspeople gathered closer. Reverend Callahan lifted his Bible. "Seems to me we ought to properly bless this spring that's brought so much good to our community, if you'll bow your heads." The preacher's weathered voice carried clearly in the evening air. "Lord, we thank you for this well of mercy you've opened in our midst, for the wisdom you've given Sister Naichi to tend it, and for Brother Jonah's courage in standing for what's right. Let this water remind us always that your grace flows freely for all your children, without regard for the boundaries we humans draw." "Amen," came the murmured response. Jonah felt Naichi's hand slip into his, her fingers warm and strong. "And Lord," Callahan continued, "bless this union you've created between two of your faithful servants. May their love continue to teach us all how to bridge the gaps between us, just as this spring bridges the seasons of drought." When he finished, Mary Wilson wiped her eyes with her apron. "That was beautiful, Reverend. And true as sunrise." The remaining townspeople dispersed slowly, calling good evenings and touching their hats. Soon only the sound of water remained, along with the evening song of cicadas in the cottonwoods. Jonah and Naichi walked hand in hand through town as the sun lowered toward the western hills. The street that had once been hostile territory now felt welcoming. Shopkeepers nodded respectfully as they passed. Outside the general store, Mr. Harrison actually stepped out to greet them. "Evening, folks," he said, touching the brim of his hat to Naichi. Ma'am, those herbs you recommended for my daughter's rash worked wonders. Much obliged. The plants give freely, Nietzsche replied with quiet dignity. I only show the way to their gifts. As they continued their walk, Jonah marveled at how natural it felt now, this simple act of walking together through town. No sideways looks, no whispered comments, just the ordinary courtesy neighbors showed to respected members of the community. They passed the spot where Jonah had first seen Nietzsche all those months ago, standing proud despite her circumstances. He stopped, fishing in his pocket until he found what he sought, a silver dollar, worn smooth with age. Been carrying this, he said, holding it up so it caught the evening light. Same one I spent that day. Found it later in my trunk. Must have been in the batch Harrison gave me for those beaver pelts. Nietzsche touched the coin gently. A small price for freedom. Turned out to be worth more than I ever dreamed, Jonah said softly. Bought me hope when I thought I'd lost it for good. Bought me family when I was sure I'd always be alone. He smiled at her. Reckon that dollar came back to me 100-fold in blessings. They continued toward home, as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. The evening air carried the scent of sage and the distant song of mourning doves. When they reached the spring, they settled on the wooden bench Jonah had built beside it. Water music filled the comfortable silence between them. Nietzsche leaned her head against Jonah's shoulder, her hand still clasped in his. This is good land, she said softly. It knows how to heal. Had a good teacher, Jonah replied, squeezing her hand. Both the land and me? A laugh bubbled up from Nietzsche's throat, surprising and musical. The sound startled a pair of quail from nearby brush, sending them scurrying through the grass. Jonah found himself chuckling too, though he wasn't quite sure at what. Maybe it was simply joy. Joy at sitting here with the woman he loved, listening to water that never stopped flowing, feeling the peace that came from knowing exactly where and with whom he belonged. Their laughter mingled with the sound of the spring, rising up toward the evening sky like a prayer of thanksgiving. The silver dollar lay forgotten in Jonah's pocket. Its worth had been transformed into something far more precious. The sound of children playing, the respect of neighbors, the blessing of a community renewed through mercy, and most of all, the love that had grown between two wounded souls who had found healing in each other. As darkness gathered and the first stars appeared, the spring continued its eternal song. Its music spoke of hope restored, of dignity reclaimed, and of love that, like water in the desert, could transform barren places into gardens of possibility. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.